Welcome to a short tutorial on War and These 2. War and These 2 is a new game, it's just come out at the end of March. This is a fairly simple basic tutorial. When I say basic, I don't mean the sort of tutorial that Strategy Dojo has on his channel. He has 4 1-hour long videos so far describing this game. The game has a manual which is well over 100 pages. It's a very long and detailed manual. It takes a lot to get into. Today I'm not going to attempt to get anywhere near that sort of detail. We are going to look at a very simple starting point. And we're going to use one of the tutorials that are available in the preset scenarios. We're going to start with the game running, and we have the initial options. Now, when you start the game, you might find that it's set in this sort of way. And one of the things to notice here is that the options to choose the side that you want to play, whether you want to play the Axis or the Soviets, is not a drop-down menu where you choose one side or the other. There is 2 buttons here, Axis or Soviets, they're just below each other. So the first thing that we want to do is pick the side that we want to play and set the other side to be computer controlled. For the tutorial that we're going to play today, we want to play as the Axis. So we want to set the Axis as human controlled, and we want to set the Soviets to be computer controlled. So that's the options that we have today on this screen.
Let's start with playing the actual scenario. So the first thing we need to do is pick this scenario. We click here and we see that there is 2 introductory scenarios listed. First one is down at the very bottom. Really Get Lucky is the one that you would imagine you would start with first. But in fact, it is a 9-turn scenario. It is contested between the Soviets and the Germans. You can play either side, but it does raise some questions about strategy and about the mechanics of the game to play it effectively. So what I would suggest is that you actually go to Introductory Scenario 2, Road to Minsk. Now, the Road to Minsk starts on June the 22nd, 1941 and ends on July the 5th, 1941. And the starting player here is listed as the Axis. This is the player that gets to take their turn first. This still does not override the settings that we've already done before, which shows whether we are the human Axis or the human Soviet. And in this case, we've chosen human Axis. We get to play the Axis and we get to start. Now, there's a little bit of a historical overview, which is then telling you that this is when Operation Barbarossa began. Army Group Center must envelop the Soviet armies in Belarus, capture the Republic's capital of Minsk, and push on to the Dnieper River. So a little bit of history there. Obviously, if you are playing this game, you're probably already interested in the history. You're probably already well aware of Operation Barbarossa and how this was conducted. Army Group Center is a massive set of combat units, which consists of 4 separate armies, many divisions. In choosing this scenario, we get to choose a lot of units, but don't let that put you off, because I'm going to show how we can make this very simple. Below that, there's then a scenario overview. For the Axis player, which is us, we want to use your infantry to break the Soviet front line on turn 1. Send your armor through the gaps you create, sweeping down into the Soviet rear to capture Minsk and isolate as many units as possible. On turn 2, have the infantry clear the pockets while the armor continues to move east. AP's turn 5. Let's break that down. So the first thing is to note that that final bullet point, AP's turn 5, is not telling you there's 5 turns. We know from the information at the top of that window that there is only 2 turns, and then it will end. So you don't get 5 turns. What you get is 5 admin points per turn. APs or admin points are a currency that you can spend on doing things within the game. And they're not something we're going to use in this scenario at all. So in fact, it's irrelevant information. So the important bits are the first 2 bullet points. If we go to the first one, we see that it says, use your infantry to break the Soviet front line on turn 1. Send your armor through the gaps you create, sweeping deep into the Soviet rear to capture Minsk. Now, two separate sentences here. Use your infantry and then sending your armor, but they're both parts of the same bullet point. The first one tells you that you should do this on turn 1. The second sentence, send your armor through the gaps you create, isn't telling you to do it on turn 1, but in fact you must do it on turn 1. That is something that I think the scenario overview doesn't make entirely clear. The suggestion is that you can capture the victory points, including Minsk, within the 2 turns, and that might bring you victory. That is not the case. You have to capture Minsk on the first turn, and you get the possibility then capture further victory points on the second turn. On the second turn, you have the infantry clear the pockets of the armor, continues to move east. We're going to see a little bit of that, but we're not going to go into any great detail with it. Let's load the scenario, and it will then ask us where to save the folder for the game saves. Now the game will save twice every turn, once when the Axis has finished its turn, and then again when the Soviets complete their turn. This means that you get regular saves throughout the game. It doesn't save every few minutes, or like some games do. Let's just accept that folder where all the save files will go in, and now we see the game ready to execute the air directives. Now there's 2 parts to every turn, the air war and the ground war. We want to concentrate on the ground war. What we're going to do is just allow the air war to play out. The AI controls this and does a pretty good job anyway of controlling it. You can quite happily play the whole game through a long campaign with letting the AI control the air war for you. You don't have to do anything. And at the minute, we will simply allow that to happen so that we can concentrate on the ground. In order to do that, all we need to do is click on this button here on the right hand top corner, execute air directives, and that will be the first part of the German turn. So remember, we are the starting player in the sense that we are the starting side which gets to take our turn first. We get the first initiative as the Germans. We get to carry out the first attacks. As historically, the first attacks took place when the Luftwaffe attacked the Soviet air bases and destroyed many of the Soviet planes on the ground, was then followed by the ground units attacking over the border. So let's just let that play, and what we'll see is all of the order of battle of the air groups. You see there all of the air groups that are listed in those icons on the screen, and you can do various things with them. You can look up lots of information about the air groups, and you can direct it in many ways, but it will carry these out. And you see it flying missions where you see lines appearing on the screen, where bombing missions take place, where air superiority missions take place with fighters, and where reconnaissance planes also go out. Now, I think I should say that I haven't got fog of war turned on here, again for simplicity, so that we can see exactly what's going on with the Soviet forces. That's not how you would play the game, but because we're just starting with a basic tutorial, that's the way I've opted to do it. So the reconnaissance missions are a little bit unnecessary. Nevertheless, the AI have flown those missions. You can see the different missions that it's flown and various statistics, and you can dig into this and you can have a lot of more information about what's going on. So you can see that in fact 5 of the air directives are for reconnaissance, 1 is for ground support, and 2 are for ground attack. Ground attack is bombing things on the ground. Ground support is a mission that's carried out at the point where your units on the ground are attacking Soviet units. You get support for those from the air during those attacks. Now, because of that, it appears from these statistics that actually no raids or sorties have taken place, and that's because they take place during the ground combat phase. So the rest of it all takes place in this phase, the reconnaissance, the ground attack. Ground attack, for instance, could be the bombing missions against the airfields, but the ground support doesn't take place in this normal air phase. It takes place during the ground combat phase, and we'll see that a little bit later. I'm going to just close out of the air phase summary. I'm not going to go into any details there, as I said, because we want to concentrate on the ground war. So we've completed the air phase of the turn, and now we get to play the ground phase. And at this stage, we're in a mode where we can move units, and we can see this from the button here up in the top left hand corner. The yellow move arrow button is the one that's highlighted in yellow, the move mode. It is possible to also enter rail mode, a naval transport mode, and an amphibious transport mode, as well as an air transport mode. These are minor parts of this game. You see them much more often if you played War in the West. But here we're going to be in ground movement. We are not going to use, in this scenario, movement by train. We're simply going to use the move mode. We've got part of the scenario here loaded where we can see a lot of German units along the front line. Now let's just go to the map info here, and I want to show a few things on the map. I'm just going to zoom out so that we can then see the whole of the front. So you can see there's two aspects to this. First of all, the button here, which is toggle enemy hexes on off, by default, that is the sort of view, so that we can see the position of our own units, the grey units that are the German units, and we can see brown ones, which are the Soviet units. So we can see from that fairly well where the front is, but it's a little indecisive. So for instance, in this area here, be unsure whether we controlled those hexes or the Soviets controlled those hexes. What I'd recommend is that you turn on the enemy hexes to show in the red color. In addition, we've then got a mode where we can see toggle victory locations on and off, and by default that's not on, and I would recommend that it is on. Now, when you click that, you can't actually see any victory locations. You can't see anything obvious going on there. What we need to do is we need to zoom out of the map. And now we see that the map is much bigger than we originally could see. We can see that there are places with flags there in the northeast corner of the map. And if we zoom out again, okay, we're a little bit far out here. Let me zoom back in again. And what I'm going to do is then center it, and you just use the left, right, up, down arrow keys on your keyboard, and you can move the map around. Let's get rid of the turn summary. So you can see the full extent of what's highlighted here on the map. Now the map itself is huge. The map covers the whole of Europe, though the full campaign is only in the war in the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union and Germany. But in this scenario, we are constrained to this part of the map only. But it's still a massive area, and the victory points are now shown to us where they are. And we can also see how far away they are from the German front lines. Now, I'm just going to take a screenshot of this. That will allow me to show some more information about the map. And we'll just have a quick look at what that actually shows us. What I've done here is take the screenshot so that I can just annotate the map with some words and some lines here, just to show a little bit of the geography. So the first thing is, the bottom left-hand corner of the map is Poland. Poland was annexed by both Germany and the Soviet Union in September 1939. So the western part of Poland was occupied by the Germans, and the eastern part was occupied by the Soviet Union. So the front lines at the start of Operation Barbarossa were slap in the middle of Poland. The first thing is that we see is that there is no victory points in the Soviet occupied territory because it isn't part of the Soviet Union. And similarly, just to the north of that is Lithuania, part of the area of operations of Army Group Center is going to cross over the border in Lithuania. Most of Lithuania is in the area of operations of Army Group North, is outside of the area of the map available within this scenario. Army Group Center is going to attack towards Belarusia and then into the main part of Russia itself towards Moscow. And a small part of the area of operations of Army Group Center is the Pripyat marshes, which is part of Ukraine. But because it's all swamp, we're actually not going to do much with that area anyway. I'm not absolutely sure exactly where these borders are. I haven't drawn it out precisely from a map, but just to give you a good idea. So what you see is the victory points are all in Belarusia, and that explains why they're so far away from us. Now I've marked on the map here in red, I've just circled Vilnius, which is a major city, and it's not so far away from the front lines of Army Group Centre, but it's in Lithuania, which explains why it isn't a victory point. And then I've marked Brest-Litovsk, which is to the south. I've marked that in red as well. So again, it's a major city which is in Poland. There isn't many major cities within the eastern part of Poland. Warsaw, Gdansk, Krakow, all in the western part. But Brest-Litovsk is just go over the border. Now, it is something that following the whole of this scenario, we would want to capture that. It's sitting on the lines of attack that we would want to go through because it has railway lines and roads through it. And in real life, it was a major objective of the first days of Operation Barbarossa. Nevertheless, it's not a part of the Soviet Union and it isn't a victory point. So the next place I've marked then in red is Minsk. Minsk is in Belarusia, not far over the border between Poland and Belarusia. That is our objective for the first day. The victory points beyond that, there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 of them. Probably see when we play why I think it's not possible to get all of them, but you could capture some of them. Minsk gets you enough points to probably win the scenario anyway. You must get that for the reasons I will show soon. You must get it on the first turn. After we've looked at the layout of the countries and shown where the victory points are, what I now want to just show fairly briefly, because when you're in the game, it's difficult to see the exact breakdown of the order of battle. What I've marked on the map there is Army Group Centre is located somewhere in the middle of the map where I put AGC. The forces under our control include 4 army equivalent commands. They are the 9th Army, the 4th Army, the 2nd Panzer Group, and the 3rd Panzer Group. Now, the 2 Panzer Groups are army-sized commands. They're treated in this game as if they are armies. They're shown with 4 X's on the units on the map, the same as the infantry armies. Although they were later in the war to describe some of these formations as panzer armies, at this stage they were still calling them panzer groups. Panzer Group 3 is only 2 corps and it is not a huge formation. Panzer Group 2, on the other hand, is a big formation. It consists of, I think, something like 4 or 5 corps. It was the Panzer Group under General Guderian. It played an important role in the entire campaign, but you can see from where I've marked on the map where the starting location of Panzer Group 2 is. It has a long way to go to get to Minsk, and it cannot get there in one turn. You can try this as much as you want, but I can assure you it's not going to get to Minsk. Really, we're forced to have to play with Panzer Group 3 in the north, which is the weaker of the 2 Panzer Groups. Panzer Group 2 could potentially force its way northeast towards some of the victory points on the second turn. We don't need to capture them. We're going to win this scenario just by capturing Minsk. I recommend that you play the scenario yourself and you take control of Panzer Group 2 and head it in a northeasterly direction and see how far you can go with it, but I'm not going to show that in this video. Equally, I'm not going to show anything relating to the 4th Army. The 4th Army needs to capture Brest-Litovsk, and it needs to do that at the start so that it forces the gap in the Soviet front lines that allows Panzer Group 2 to then pass through the Soviet lines. What we are going to concentrate on is the northern part of this scenario. So we're going to take the 9th Army. We are going to use a couple of its corps to break through the Soviet lines in the north to force enough of a gap that will allow Panzer Group 3 to pass through those lines and then head towards Vilnius before turning to more of an easterly direction towards Minsk. The Panzer Group cannot go in a more direct line because of the way the terrain is. the infrastructure, the road and rail network, heads towards Vilnius, and then the route from Vilnius is directly east. So you see I've marked on the map this sort of direction that we've got to go. This is not immediately apparent within the game, the order of battle. There is lots of tools to help you see this information, but there's so many German units on the map, with many of them stacked in the same hexes, that it's difficult to make any sort of sense of it. But I will show you how to do that. We return to the map now in the game. So we're at this northern part of the front where we showed before. This is where the 9th Army and the 3rd Panzer Group are located in all of this area here. Now, as I mentioned, it's a bit difficult to make any clear sense of that immediately because of the fact that there is so many units in this area where they are often stacked on top of each other. But what we'll see is that there is some light green units, which are the 9th Army, and there are some sort of lime-coloured units, which are the Panzer Group. Now, as I said, if they're stacked on top of each other, you can't see the colour behind them, but you can see here, for instance, if I click on that one, it goes red and it has the purple border around it. What's selected now is, as we see over on the right hand side, is the 20th Motorized Division, and in the same stack is the 9th Army. The 9th Army is now below this tile, so if we click again on the stack, then the 9th Army is selected. So you can now see the 9th Army is the one that's now shown at the top of this stack, has 4 X's, and it is, using the NATO counters, it is shown as an HQ. Over on the right, we see the 2 tiles which are part of this stack, the 20th Motorized Division and the 9th Army. In the tile here, that it's purple. In other words, it's selected. The 9th Army is located in this position. If I just select away from the 9th Army, so I can just click anywhere on the map with a right click, the 9th Army is no longer selected. As I mentioned, the 9th Army and all of its units are shown with a light green background to the counters. Now, if we scroll down, what we'll see is the 9th Army actually comes all the way down here, but we don't need to worry about this part of the front. What we're interested in is this part of the front here. As we mentioned, that we want to push out from the front in this sort of location towards Vilnius. But if we come down the front, what we'll see is there are units which are in white, units which are in blue, units which are in a light blue. There's various coloured units to show which units belong to which command. Here we see a stack which shows a lime counter which has 4 X's. Click on that, it selects the 206th Infantry Division, and we see that over on the right. And below that is the 3rd Panzer Group. Click again on the stack and the Panzer Group is now selected. Now, when we have the Panzer Group selected, it's difficult to see it actually, but we have 2 sets of lines that are coming out of this. One is an orange line, which is going to the south, and it's heading right off the map. And it connects the Panzer Group to the command above it, and that is Army Group Center. Now, we see this in the tile here. It tells us that the unit we got selected is the 3rd Panzer Group and its command unit is the Army Group Center. The orange line from the tile on the map is showing us where that is located. In addition, we have several blue lines coming. Now, these are very faint and they're not very easy to see because of the other stacks around it. But there is some blue lines coming from this Panzer Group towards other divisions here. And what we can see is, let's just move the counter away from here. What we can see is that some units are highlighted with a blue border. Others are highlighted with a yellow border. And again, I'll just show you that if I select away from the Panzer Group, none of the units now have borders around them. As soon as I go back to the Panzer Group, we now have units with a blue border and units with a yellow border. The ones with a yellow border are the ones that are at the same level as the Panzer Group. In other words, the 9th Army, as we've already shown, they are both Army level units, the Panzer Group and the 9th Army, so they're both yellow. The blue units are the units below the Panzer Group. So this is one of them here. Let's select that one. And now we find that that unit is the 39th Motorized Corps. Now when we select that, its tile on the right-hand side shows us that its commanding group is the 3rd Panzer Group, as we expected, because we've just come from the 3rd Panzer Group. And now we see on the map that it is the Motorized Corps which has the purple border around it, and an orange line going to an orange border unit, which is the Panzer Group. So every time as we move up and down the command structure, the unit that we have selected is marked with a purple border. The unit above it in the command structure is marked with an orange border. Units below the one we have selected are the blue border, and ones at the same level are a yellow border. Now we have a set of units on the map with a blue border, and they are the members of the 39th Motorized Corps. So if we select this one, we now find that this is the 14th Motorized Division. And again, according to its tile on the right-hand side, it is under the command of the 39th Motorized Corps, as we would expect. That's where we've just come from. And now the Motorized Corps is orange. It's the level above the 14th Motorized Division. The 14th Motorized Division has nothing below it, so it has nothing that's blue on the map at this point. A division never has any units below it, though it is possible to have smaller units than a division, but they're never commanded by a division. The yellow units are now the other divisions within the Motorized Corps. So let's just select this one, and that confirms again that that is the situation. And we have the 20th Panzer Division. Again, according to its tile on the right-hand side, as we'd expect, it is under the command of the 39th Motorized Corps. The 39th Motorized Corps still marked as orange. There is no blue units on the map, as we'd expect, because there's no units below the level of the Panzer Division. There's still units on the map which are marked yellow, which are the other ones within the Motorized Corps. So we can navigate around the units here and see the order of battle and see what is related to which units and what are the command. There are 2 corps within the Panzer Group. Let's just go back to here. We've got the Panzer Group selected again. There are 2 units on the map which are marked in blue. This one here that we've already seen, the Motorized Corps, but there was also one in this hex. And there is 3 units here stacked, as we can see on the right. Let's just select the 57th Motorized Corps. So for the 57th Motorized Corps, we can see, again, there are blue units on the map, 3 of them, one here, and one in the stack here below the other units. So we have 2 corps for the Panzer Group. As I said, this is a much weaker force than the 2 Panzer Group, which has, I think, something like 4 or maybe even 5 corps attached to it. Let's go back again to the Panzer Group. Yellow units are the ones at the same level, and this includes the 9th Army. Again, we can find our way back to it without having to remember exactly where it is on the map. So the 9th Army is here. Several blue counters on the map. One here, one here, one here, and the last one here. So there are 4 corps below the 9th Army. Now, we don't need to use all of these corps. Again, remind ourselves we need to force our way through the front line here to allow the Panzer Group to escape towards the northeast, towards Vilnius, and then on towards Minsk. We don't need to do anything with the front in this area. Certainly not in this tutorial. Though I recommend that if you play it yourself, you actually do it and you control those units and you get used to moving the units around and making attacks. But for us today, we're going to concentrate on this northern part of the front. So from the 9th Army, we are going to go to this corps here. And we're going to start here right at the northernmost part of the front. Now, when we've got this corps selected, it's the 6th Corps. We say there are 2 divisions only, and there are these 2 here on the front line. So the 6th Corps has 2 infantry divisions, the 26th Infantry Division and the 6th Infantry Division. And from here, we can push outwards towards this part of the Soviet units. We can say when we have a unit selected, we have this sort of effect that, you see, if we want to move down towards Bishdorf here on the map, we get this set of icons displayed, which shows that this unit can move all the way down to Bishdorf. And those numbers on the icons represent the movement points. Now, if we look on the unit on the map, it has two numbers at the bottom of it. They are 26 and 16. Those two numbers are also on the tile on the right-hand side, 26 and 16. And the 16 is the movement points. When we move one single hex, we will be left with 14 movement points. If we move two hexes, we'll be left with 13. If we move three, we'll be left with 12, etc. And what we see is the further away we move, the more movement points we use. So we can actually move this unit quite far, all the way to here, before we run out of movement points. However, that's moving away from the direction we want to go. If we try and move up here, we get none of these icons. The game will not allow us to move to one of these hexes. And that's because it knows that, one, we can't go off the map, off the area of the scenario, these dark grey hexes. And two, we can't pass through to these Soviet-controlled hexes. It won't allow us to move directly through an enemy unit. So the first thing is we need to attack the Soviet unit in this hex here. Now, when we hover over the Soviet unit, we see that instead of a movement icon, we have this icon which shows something like well, I don't know what that's supposed to be. It looks like almost like a rocket with a little explosion below it. And this is what's called a hasty attack. So we can have a hasty attack against this Soviet hex. If we look at the pop-up below in the black box that's shown when we have the mouse hovered over this hex, we can see it tells us hold down the shift key for a deliberate attack. The attack combat value is 13.3 and the defense combat value is 0.3. Okay, what does that mean? The attack combat value 13.3 is our combat value of the 26th Infantry Division. And the defensive combat value 0.3 is the combat value of the Soviet unit. 13.3 against 0.3 is an overwhelming odds of superiority. We should defeat this Soviet unit extremely easy, very quickly. We should rout them, or we should make them surrender, or we will force them to retreat. Now, I suspect with those odds, they won't even retreat. They will be shattered or routed, or they will surrender. All of those are possibilities, those three, and they have an effect, and I will point it out when those effects actually happen. The infantry division could attack the whole infantry division against this. It's a fortified unit, by the way. The counter that was shown is a sort of border fortified unit. It's only shown with one X. It's only a brigade. No, it's only shown with two eyes. So it is only regiment sized. It's a very weak unit. If we hover over it, because we don't have fog of war on, we can see at the bottom of the pop-up message that the hex is Soviet controlled. It is a fortified hex. It's got a fort level of 2, which increases the defense values. So that's not bad that it's dug in this unit. However, it is only a machine gun stroke artillery battalion. So it's a very weak unit with only a defensive value of 0.3. So we don't need to attack this with the whole infantry division. So the first thing I'm going to show you is that we can split any of our divisions into 3 parts. And we do it with this button here. The keyboard shortcut is B, and the button here is build up or break down units. So when we click on this, we break down the infantry division. And what we'll find is we now have that infantry division split to 3 regiments. So you see each of the tiles here on the right, 3 tiles now, and each of them have 3 eyes. 3 eyes is a regiment. So we now have 3 parts to this division, and each of them can now operate independently. And I'm just going to take the 3rd regiment, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show that that can carry out a hasty attack. And because we're using only a regiment now to attack, the attacking combat value is only 4.3. The defense combat value is still 0.3, it's still the same. But we still have major odds in our favor, even with using 1 regiment. Now, of course, this was a planned attack, and the infantry regiment prepared for this for some time before Operation Barbarossa was launched. So, of course, this was a very deliberate attack. the game doesn't necessarily allow for the fact that the planning of this particular attack on the day that the operation was launched was planned over weeks, maybe even months. You can plan over a shorter period, but if you do use a deliberate attack, you increase your attack value by double. However, you use more of your movement points. And the reason for that is those 16 movement points are to allow you to move over a whole week. What we saw before was this unit can move all the way across here in a turn, and what it's doing is marching day by day by day over 7 days. As soon as we do an attack on an enemy unit, we're perhaps using a whole day or more of a day out of the turn of 7 days. So we use up some of our movement points. If we hold the shift key down and do a right click on the Soviet unit, the attack goes in launched. We see in the center of that panel 179 to 0, and we say that that unit was defeated. Now that wasn't up on the screen for very long, but let me just see if I can show the battle sites. And what I want to do is just show the ground battle sites. We now have an icon on the screen showing us that there's been a battle at this hex. And that allows us now to hover over that and see some information, or to click on it and come back to this panel which was up on the screen only for a short period of time. If we want to now dig into this information, we can. What we see is the 3rd Regiment of the 26th Infantry Division was involved in the attack, and it was under the command of the 6th Corps. That was commanded by Förster. And we attacked the machine gun comb artillery battalion under Pavlov that was under the command of the Western Military District. The odds were massively in our favour. It wasn't up on the screen very long before, but that battalion surrendered. So it surrendered and has gone off the map. Now if we go to the info screens, we can see the losses screen. And straight away we can see that in the current turn, the Soviets now have lost 529 in the last action, 3,009 men in the current turn. Half of them were killed, half of them were captured when the unit surrendered. A small number of them are disabled, they are injured in hospital or whatever. We can see all of those details and what happened to that unit. So the unit has now disappeared entirely off the map. Okay, so we just click back to the move mode, and those icons showing where the battles have taken place have gone. And what I want to show you now is that there is also another icon in the hex where we've just attacked. It's a very small icon here, and it is a little circle with a number 1 in it. And when we hover over the hex, it's a rough hex, which is part of the Soviet Union, but it's axis controlled now, and you see it's no longer coloured with the light red colour that the other Soviet controlled hexes are. It's now controlled by the axis, and it has a combat delay of 1. Now what does that mean? It means that when we move through this hex, we now have an additional movement point that we have to use because this hex has been damaged by the combat. This is normal. When we carry out combat, we unfortunately damage some of the roads, the bridges, the towns that we need to pass through. They all suffer some sort of damage, and that will delay our movement through this hex. So the fact it's a rough hex, that it's sort of hilly, would take some of our movement points, but also there's a combat delay of 1, which would take another movement point. If we go back and select the regiment, the 3rd Regiment of the 26th Infantry Division, we can now see that it can move into that hex, and it has currently 13 movement points left. Here, if we look at the tile, we can see it's 613, combat value of 6, movement points of 13. Now it started with 16 movement points, so it's used 3 already to carry out the attack. If we move into this hex, it gets down to 11. So it needs another 2 movement points simply to move into this hex. One because of the combat delay and another one because of the rough territory. It can move past that hex and it can move all the way to here. So we can move to here or we can move to here. These hexes that we're allowed to move to are a slightly lighter colour than the other Soviet hexes. So we are allowed to move all the way to the railway line here. So I'm going to just right click and advance this unit to there. So the important point there is to note that we are allowed to move past the other Soviet units which are around it. Some games won't allow you to enter a hex adjoining an enemy unit and continue your movement. You have to stop and enter combat. You can't move past an adjoining enemy unit. This game you do. One of the things that you then see that there's a gap in the Soviet lines, and it is possible to move into that gap. So we've now moved this unit quite far forward, away from all of our other units. We need to catch the other units up as quickly as possible because it could potentially be isolated, and we no longer have a solid front line. But you can now see why I split this division up. First of all, that I didn't need the whole infantry division to attack the Soviet unit that was there, the battalion, because even one single regiment could defeat it. And now I get the option to move the other parts of the regiment. Oh, just going to select each one of them and move them. And I can move them independently. And now we have the 26th Infantry Division with its regiments split into 3 separate hexes. So that's pretty cool. We can now spread our forces out into a wider front line. Of course, what we have to remember when we do that is that each individual regiment is not as strong as the infantry division as a whole. So the individual parts could be attacked and defeated much easier than if they were in one hex altogether. You have to balance this out, but we've now got units across 3 hexes, and we can still advance these units because they still have movement points. This one, when we have it selected, the 1st regiment, we've only moved 1 hex. We still have plenty of movement points to move up to here, and even move well beyond this. When we were on this one, the 3rd regiment, we can't. Now that seems odd. We aren't allowed to move to these 2 hexes here. However, this one does. The reason is this one has far more movement points left. And this particular hex that it's trying to move into is a swamp. Swamps need a lot of movement points to move through it. This regiment with 8 movement points doesn't have enough to move into the swamp. This regiment with 12 movement points does. And this one with 14 movement points does. The regiments, by splitting them, we've used only 1 so far to actually carry out any sort of combat. It's retained the movement points of the other regiments to allow them to move much further forward. Again, we've got to be careful about how far we move them forward in case there was a counterattack. Now, as we're going to see, there will be no counterattacks on the Soviet Union. They're caught completely by surprise. We can smash all of their units to put them in a position where they cannot counterattack us in the first turn or the second turn. In the campaign as a whole, it's something we'd have to be fairly careful of, not to move these individual regiments too far forward into positions where they could be surrounded or they could be counterattacked and easily defeated. What I'm going to use is, instead of moving this one quite far forward, I'm going to now show that this one can also do a hasty attack on these Soviet units. In this particular hex, there are 2 Soviet units. Again, both battalions, these combined machine gun and artillery battalions. Again, although dug in, because they're only battalion strength, they're very weak. The hasty attack gives us 4.2 attack value, and the defense value is now 0.5. It's stronger than the original one that we tried. The original one we attacked with only had a 0.3 when it was a single battalion. These 2 battalions together are 0.5. But you see it's still overwhelming odds. And if we make it a deliberate attack, we put the odds up to 8.4. Now, as I've shown, if we do a deliberate attack, we use more of our movement points. So what I'm just going to show here is I'm going to do a hasty attack. I don't need to do a deliberate attack. I have more than enough attack value to defeat these 2, I hope. And that will conserve some of our movement points. So note that this has 14 movement points left. I'm going to just allow it to carry out the attack. Up here, 24.5 to 0.1. Let me just put again the icons on for combat. And again, we say if I click here, we can now look at those values. We had overwhelming odds in our favor. The 2 Soviet battalions both surrendered and have disappeared off the map. That's proved that we did not need to do a deliberate attack. Just close that panel down, and I will just go back to the movement mode so that those 2 icons for the combat disappear off the map. And now you see that the infantry regiment has changed from 14 movement points to only 13. we have conserved more of our movement points than we would have done if we'd done a deliberate attack. And we've still got the same outcome, that we forced the enemy units to surrender. So we now have 13 movement points, but we also say that the Soviet hex that we've now captured, that's gone grey, hasn't got a combat damage icon. Because we've carried out a hasty attack and we haven't spent as long preparing this, we haven't say bombarded them with artillery and things like that, then we have caused less damage to this hex and we can move through this hex a lot easier. So that's another thing that's interesting to note. The infantry division has conserved more of its movement points and it can advance much easier through this hex. Now, this is very important because the Panzer Group is going to probably also advance through this specific hex. And the reason we know that is because we can see that this hex has a railway line there. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to show in the map info that we can turn on with an R, with this button here, we can toggle roads on and off. By default, they're not on. Now we get on the map some dotted red lines. And those dotted red lines are the roads. And those roads enable us to move further than we would in open territory. Let's note that these are the main roads. They can still be minor roads which are not marked with the red dots. So even some of the other hexes, they might have tracks and minor roads. And you can look at the detail of that from each individual hex. But the main roads are marked. And you see that the main roads, let me just show if I move the cursor away from that hex, that as well as the hex that we've just took control over here has no combat damage and it has a road and a railway line through it. The roads are progressing up this direction towards Vilnius. Now, unfortunately, the roads go outside of the area of operation of the army group off the map of this scenario. There are no main roads here, just a railway line. But then the roads continue east towards Minsk, which is here. So we can get nearly all the way to Minsk on main roads. And that's what we want the Panzer Group to do. We want to use main roads so they can proceed as quickly as possible. And we want them to avoid going through damaged hexes. So we have a mixture of options. We have hasty attack, uses less movement points and causes less damage, but doesn't deliver as much of a punch against the enemy. We can have a much stronger attack, a deliberate attack. We hold the shift key down to have a deliberate attack, but it causes more damage to the hex that we capture and it uses more of our movement points. However, it also has much more likelihood that the enemy unit will be shattered or routed at the end of it, or it will surrender rather than simply retreat. If it retreats, the unit will move 2 or 3 hexes back on the map and it will stay on the map and will still be available to fight further battles. Really, what we want in most cases is to destroy the enemy units, particularly at this stage of the war. We want to destroy as many units as possible so that we remove them completely from the map and they're not in our way and they're not blocking our path towards Minsk. So let's progress this a little bit further. This unit now still has 13 movement points. It can move further forward to this hex it's just captured, and it still has 11 movement points. This one here, it's now spread out, forming a front line, but it actually doesn't need to stay in that hex because the hexes it adjoins to are not Soviet controlled. They are off the scenario map, so we may as well move that one forward as well. And this one still has 11 movement points and still has plenty of movement points to now attack this unit. And again, as we've shown, we can do a hasty attack at 3.9 against 0.5. Or we can do a deliberate attack 7.9 against 0.5. And we know that with those sort of odds, 3.9 to 0.5, we should easily defeat this unit. But what I want to show is we now have 2 regiments stacked in this particular hex. And if I click again on the stack, the one that's selected changes over and we have the 3rd regiment selected. Click it again, the 2nd regiment. Click it again, the 3rd regiment. Now the 3rd regiment also could do a hasty attack and its attack value is less than the 2nd regiment. And this is because it's already been engaged in combat once already, and it has already used some of its combat strength. So you see on the tiles on the right hand side, the 3rd Regiment has a combat value, an attack value of 5 and movement points of 8, while the 2nd Regiment has an attack value of 7. What we can do is, if we go to the tiles on the right hand side here, we can click on the 2nd Regiment, and you see that both of them are now selected. Both of them have the highlighting around their tile, the yellow highlighting, and both of them are purple around the border of the tile here, and both of them are selected with the purple on the map. If we now go to a hasty attack, we can see that the attack value is 6.8 against 0.5. So what we're going to do here now is use 2 regiments to attack this unit. Now I think we don't need to do that. We could simply attack with 1 only. What we're shown here is that it is possible to attack with 2. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm simply going to go back to the weaker of the 2, select again, and this now selects simply back to one of them by clicking on the stack. Click on the stack again and get the 3rd. I'm going to do a deliberate attack with the 3rd. Now, I'm not going to do a deliberate attack there. So I could do a deliberate attack, which would be 5.7 to 0.5. But I'm going to try a hasty attack. I'm going to take the risk. And the reason I want to do that is, again, I can see that this hex has the road and the railway line going through it. And I want to cause as little damage as possible. So I'm going to right click on there. Unfortunately, you see, again, massive odds in our favour. 64 to 1, I think it was, and the unit surrendered. The hasty attack still did the job. We have so much in our favour at the start of turn 1 on this scenario that we don't need to do deliberate attacks, and we don't need to use more than a single regiment in some of these attacks. So again, we've now cleared the way pretty well. I'm just going to show you, if I select this Panzer division here, this is part of the Panzer group, remember we saw this a little earlier, that the Panzer group now has the ability to move right the way through the lines. As I mentioned, there's nothing in this game which stops you moving through adjoining hexes of enemy units. So we can get not only to here where we have control, where they're grey, but we can move all the way into these red hexes, the Soviet-controlled hexes. And we can move all the way past these units. Now we're not moving on the roads here, we're moving through open territory. But we move back onto the road here, and we still would have 34 of our 50 movement points. Now notice that shows us straight away one major difference between a panzer division and an infantry division. If you remember, the infantry divisions only started with 16 movement points, and they've had to use quite a few of them movement points simply to get rid of the weak Soviet units in front of them. And they're struggling to move much further because of things like the swamps, there's a river to cross, and things like that. Panzer division has 50 movement points, and it can move quite far. See how far it can actually move. So here's Vilnius. We can move all the way to Vilnius and still have 33 movement points. Past Vilnius, past this Soviet Union, and I'm just going to use the arrow keys to scroll so I can see Minsk, all the way to Minsk with this Panzer Division. So already we have opened up sufficient gap in the front lines to enable us to get the Panzer Group and very far forward into Soviet-controlled territory all the way to Minsk. Now I'm just going to show that it is possible, nearly, no not quite. We run out of movement points before we get to this victory point, which is Borisov. Unfortunately, Borisov is out of range. Even if we do nothing else, if all we do is move this Panzer division, it cannot reach Borisov. This was a point I made before. What we're going to do is we're going to move and attack Minsk on the first turn. We can't attack any of the others, they're too far away. But even when we go to Minsk, if we move all the way here, the important point is we arrive with still some movement points left. It's not enough to just simply get to this hex, because if we don't have movement points left, we cannot carry out an attack. And the more movement points we have left when we arrive here, we could carry out a deliberate attack or we could carry out a hasty attack. If we arrive here with only a couple of movement points left, we carry out a deliberate attack, we damage Minsk, we may not end up with enough movement points left to actually enter the city. the control would flip to us. The hex would go grey to access controlled. But what would immediately happen is the Soviets would simply move other units back into the city and recapture it. I'm going to split the video there. We'll come back in a second part and discuss the actual attack on Minsk, complete that operation, capture the victory point, and show why it's so important to do that on the first turn. And we'll have a little bit look at the second turn without going into too much detail. What I'm trying to do here is to show how you can start to play this game without being too intimidated by the sheer scale of it and the depth of it. It is possible to play the game and to get enjoyment out of it and to understand the strategy without getting too bogged down in some of the details. This is my first ever video. If you like it, then please subscribe, comment, all of those good things. Let me know how you feel about the video, what you got out of it, what you think I could do better or improve on, and look forward to seeing you in the second part.